the weekend edition of News Center 5.
Good Saturday evening. I'm Mike Jackson.
And I'm Dick Kay.
In our news tonight, a huge luxury liner on a 30-day cruise to the Orient is burning at sea in the Gulf of Alaska. Here's a late report from NBC's Bill Sternoff.
The luxury liner Prinsendam, cruising from Vancouver, Canada to the Orient by way of Alaska, has been abandoned in the Gulf of Alaska about 180 miles west of Juneau. Minutes after these pictures were taken by NBC News, the last of the ship's crew and Coast Guardsmen trying to put out the fire were airlifted away. The fire, which began in the engine room, spread through the ship and forced the pre-dawn evacuation of all 390 passengers and 210 crew members. They bobbed in the cold Alaskan waters until they were picked up by oil supertankers. The tankers are steaming for the Valdez harbor. The passengers and crew from the stricken cruise liner are expected to arrive sometime Sunday. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Valdez, Alaska.
Here in Chicago, we hooked up with a Homewood man whose parents were passengers aboard that Dutch luxury liner. His name is Thomas Miller. His parents, Donald and Elsa Miller, have been in contact with their son, and he told our Tom Korzanowski this isn't the first time they've been through such an experience.
From what I've heard, that there have been no casualties, and if I remember, this is the second ship that's gone down under them, so they went through it once. They're not novice to this.
Your father and mother were aboard a ship once before that had a
Yes,
problem?
sir. That they had to abandon ship in the Mediterranean a couple years ago, like 25 years ago or so.
The senior Millers are from Hinsdale.
Good morning. I'm Charles Kuralt, and this is Sunday Morning. Right now, the news headlines for the first Sunday morning of October. All 510 persons who were aboard, 320 passengers and 190 crew members, have been evacuated successfully from a burning cruise ship, the Prinsendam, in the Gulf of Alaska. Most have been put aboard ships, others flown to Sitka. The Coast Guard says there are some injured among the survivors. There was a close call. A lifeboat with 20 people was lost in stormy seas for 3 hours during the night.
Two women from West Texas were on board the cruise ship Prinsendam when it caught fire yesterday in the Gulf of Alaska. The two women are safe, but now the Coast Guard is not sure it has rescued all the passengers and crew who abandoned the burning ship. 510 people were rescued yesterday after floating for more than 10 hours in lifeboats. The Coast Guard thought everyone was accounted for. But this morning, a cutter came up on another lifeboat with 20 passengers who had floated all night long in the cold Alaskan waters. That discovery was followed by conflicting reports about just how many people were on board the Prinsendam when it caught fire. Search parties are still crisscrossing the area.
Now, the weekend edition of News Center 5.
Hello, everybody. I'm Linda Yu.
And I'm Terry Burhans.
I have an update on a shipping disaster. Over 500 passengers who had been forced to abandon a Dutch luxury liner that caught fire are safe tonight. A Coast Guard cutter located and rescued 20 more people who had spent a cold night in a lifeboat off the Alaskan coast. A raging fire in the engine room had forced the passengers as well as crew members to evacuate that ship. Officials now are calling it the largest single ship rescue in modern history.
The 9 o'clock news with John Drury and the WGN News team, reporting all the local news, weather and sports, and the national and international news from our independent network news team in New York. Now, John Drury.
The abandoned cruise ship Prinsendam continues to burn off the Alaskan coast tonight, but crew members and all of the ship's passengers are believed to be safe. A Coast Guard cutter rescued 18 people on a lifeboat early this morning. They spent the cold night on choppy seas. Other than a couple of cases of exposure, everyone seems to be in good shape. Canadian and American Coast Guard ships and helicopters and an oil tanker all took part in the day-long rescue operation, which the Coast Guard says is the biggest in modern history, over 500 people saved. At a press conference in New York today, the owners of the ship Holland America said that all passengers will be compensated for what they lost on board. The ship is now burning from top to bottom. The fire will have to burn itself out. And how did it get out of control? Well, fire doors simply did not contain the flames.
Thank you, fellas. Thank you. My family on my mother's side are all Canadians. I live just across the border from Windsor, Ontario, Canada, in a Southfield, Michigan, which borders Detroit, Michigan. You were asking me about what happened on the ship. About 1:30, while my wife and I were sleeping, we smelled smoke. And when we got up and went up the gangway, sure enough, there was smoke there. There were other couples in the gangway, yes.
Once you went through all of that and got into the lifeboats, was it very long until the Coast Guard came to get you?
Quite long. I was on the water about 13 hours. My wife was picked up, God bless them.
Canadian Coast Guard did well?
A frogman came down and picked the women up first. And they didn't come back. Apparently they ran out of fuel and had to refuel. And upon their return, I don't think they could find us. And we continued to drift. And the Coast Guard cutter, Boutwell, pulled alongside approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, which was about 12 or 13 hours later. And they horse-collared and winched us up by hand, the remaining people in Lifeboat 5. And I can't say enough for both Coast Guards and all the people and passengers who are mostly mature and elderly, never did panic, and they were all under good control.
Thank you very much. What's your feeling now that it's all over? Now, considering what you've rest? Any bitter feelings at all?
No, I'm just happy it's over. It's just one of those things, I think. Actually, if it had to happen, we were fortunate the way it turned out.
How's that? I mean, besides living, I know that.
Yeah. Well, I was just telling my husband if it had been the next day, I don't think they could have accomplished the rescue. We would have been out too far. So, and I think that all the rescue attempts were magnificent. And the Williamsburg, they couldn't have done more for us. And the townspeople in Alaska.
But no bitter feelings toward the cruise company at all?
Well, no, I don't have any bitter feelings.
You lost so much.
Yes, I did. But I've got my life.
Thank you very much. What's your name?
Terry Volkman, Johnny Morris, and Susan Anderson. With the Channel 2 News at 5.
Alaska tonight. More than 500 passengers and crewmen who were rescued from a burning ship on Saturday are awaiting flights to Seattle. Coast Guard firefighters tried to board that ship, a Dutch ship, today, hoping to save it. The cost of the ship is $25 million. The passengers, many of whom spent a dozen or more hours in lifeboats, are saying they are thankful and consider themselves lucky to be alive.
Terribly cold. It was terribly cold, and I was sopping wet There was no cover over the lifeboat, and we were all sopping wet.
Well, first it wasn't bad, but after a few hours, I said, "Dear Lord, I don't mind going, but it's a nasty way to go."
We were getting a little nervous. Particularly my husband and I, we didn't have our life jackets, and then they said, what difference does it make if you go overboard? You can only last in these Alaskan waters maybe less than 15 minutes.
Despite the trying conditions, no deaths or serious injuries were reported. Now
This is Monday morning, October 6th, and from CBS News in New York, here is Morton Dean.
Good morning. Hope you had a good weekend. Welcome back. 506 people we know of did not have a good weekend. They had to abandon ship when the luxury liner Prinsendam caught fire off the coast of Alaska. Iran and Iraq spent their weekend at war, and the American hostages are spending their 338th day as prisoners in Iran. Some details now. It was early Saturday morning when the fire was discovered on the Holland America cruise ship. The lifeboats were lowered. Helicopter rescue units and ships in the area, more than 100 miles at sea, responded to the SOS. On Saturday night, in the belief that everyone had been accounted for and saved, the rescue effort was called off. Then the Coast Guard realized 18 passengers and 2 Air Force paramedics were still missing. Yesterday, their lifeboat was sighted, and they were rescued by a Coast Guard cutter. "We were left all alone in the fog," said Regina O'Malley of New York City. "It was very, very scary. The waves were incredible." Another passenger said the waves were 30 or 40 feet high. The frigid sea washed into their lifeboat. They were cold, scared, and seasick. It's over now and will be recorded as at least one of history's biggest and most successful rescues at sea. More on the story from Bernard Goldberg.
It began as a pleasure cruise and ended abruptly as a nightmare at sea. The 427-foot Prinsendam en route from Canada to the Orient when a fire broke out in the boiler room, then spread, turning the deluxe luxury liner into a burning disaster, dead in the cold, choppy waters of the Gulf of Alaska. Some 500 passengers and crew abandoned ship, some of them bobbing in lifeboats for 12 hours and longer. But everyone was rescued, plucked from their lifeboats by the Coast Guard. The passengers who arrived in Sitka, a small town along the southern Alaskan coast, said their ordeal was wet, cold, and at times frightening.
The Prinsendam just drifted off by itself, and we drifted off in another direction.
It sounds eerie.
Yes, it does, and it was pitch black out there. It was terribly cold. It was terribly cold, and I was sopping wet. There was no cover over the lifeboat, and we were all sopping wet.
Well, first it wasn't bad, but after a few hours, I said, "Dear Lord, I don't mind going, but it's a nasty way to go."
When my wife went up in the helicopter, I, tear rolled down my cheek, and I thought that'd be the last time I'd ever see her. And it just didn't look like there was enough time to get everybody out. The seas were rising.
We were getting a little nervous. Particularly my husband and I, we didn't have our life jackets, and then they said, what difference does it make if you go overboard? You can only last in these Alaskan waters maybe less than 15 minutes.
And late yesterday afternoon, a Coast Guard cutter arrived in Sitka carrying some of the last passengers picked from the ocean.
I didn't think you'd be coming. I thought you'd be at Aldi's. I knew.
What everyone was poignantly aware of is that this drama at sea might have ended tragically, with many deaths. As it was, there were only a few relatively minor medical problems. Some passengers suffered from exposure to the cold, wet weather. Mrs. Solomon was at dockside too, waiting for her husband.
He's okay. He's in Valdez.
As frightening as it was for the passengers, they are all aware that it could have been far worse. So now, with the rescue operation completed, officials are turning to the question of how it all began in the first place. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
Time now 30 minutes past the hour, and Monday morning continues with Morton Dean in New York.
The headlines this morning: the more than 500 passengers and crew of the burned-out luxury liner Prinsendam are safe and ashore in Alaska. The talk of a ceasefire between Iraq and Iran has been drowned out by gunfire. About that near disaster at sea, many came ashore with tales of a night to remember. For 20, though, the tale of the day they were almost forgotten. The 20 were 18 evacuees and 2 Air Force paramedics who drifted for hours in high seas in their life raft until someone discovered they were still missing. Now all the passengers and crew are accounted for, and the last of them are back on land this morning. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
The oil tanker Williamsburg lumbered into Valdez Harbor in the evening mist. Its unexpected cargo of 359 stranded cruise passengers, by now accustomed to the drone of television reporters' helicopters overhead. The luxury ship they fled in the middle of the night lay listing helplessly in the Gulf of Alaska. No way to tell, Holland America officials said, if it can be salvaged. No explanation of why the fire could not be contained or of how it started. As the passengers headed home, National Guard cargo planes brought emergency Red Cross equipment, tennis shoes, blankets, cots, to be set up wherever space could be found, at a construction camp unused since pipeline days, in banquet rooms at Valdez's 5 hotels. Among the first off the ship, the radio operator who took the Prinsendam's distress call. Tell me what you heard from the Prinsendam.
Just SOS, SOS. This is the Prinsendam, and passenger ship on fire, engine rooms on fire, and situation unknown.
As darkness fell, the passengers, some still in their pajamas, many elderly, and all weary, slowly made their way to waiting buses.
I was on it about 9.5 hours, but I never feared for my life. There were always the Coast Guards above, over the lifeboat, watching us, and I knew we'd be saved.
We got into the lifeboats, but they were slightly overloaded. We can't say enough about the Air Force and Coast Guard.
Plans now depend a lot on the ever-inclement Alaska weather. If possible, Holland America will land 737 jets here tomorrow to take passengers to Anchorage, where they will begin the last leg of their exhausting journey home. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Valdez, Alaska.
From the crew of Good Morning South Mississippi and WLOX-TV Biloxi, good morning, America.
Good morning. Matching shirts. Morning, everybody. I'm David Hartman with Joan London. We're not wearing matching shirts. Monday, 6th of October.
One of the biggest sea rescues in history has ended happily, with more than 500 passengers from a Dutch cruise ship safe in Alaska this morning. But the abandoned luxury liner Prinsendam is still burning in the Gulf of Alaska, with the cause of the weekend fire still unknown. Many of the passengers were Americans, and Tom Shell was there when one group arrived in Alaska.
The Coast Guard cutter Boutwell arrived at Sitka, Alaska just before dark last night, carrying 80 of the survivors from the Dutch cruise ship. The group included 18 people who spent Saturday night in a lifeboat, enduring sub-freezing temperatures and heavy seas. They were the last ones rescued, but they had one more boat ride. Because of the shallow harbor at Sitka, the survivors were transferred to a smaller boat for the final leg of the journey back to dry land. There was a warm welcome from the residents of Sitka as the first survivors stepped ashore. One man, a diabetic, suffered from insulin shock, but the other survivors were in good shape. Police and Coast Guardsmen helped them to waiting buses.
What do we do?
Yeah. There wasn't not much talking, or it was really just trying to conserve energy and warmth. Our last 6 hours after the Coast Guard boat left into the fog, we were out there alone, and it was very, very shaky.
People were cold and very sick.
All the passengers and crew from the ill-fated Prinsendam spent the night in Alaska. An airlift to return them to their homes begins this morning. Tom Shell, ABC News.
Good morning, Buffalo, New York. It's today, Monday, October the 6th. Hey, let's begin now with the latest news if we can. It is being called one of the biggest sea rescues in maritime history, certainly one of the most successful. A weekend drama played out in the frigid waters of the Gulf of Alaska. Bill Sternoff reports that more than 500 passengers and crewmen from a burning Dutch cruise ship now have been brought safely ashore, some of them to Sitka.
More than 80 survivors were aboard the Coast Guard cutter Boutwell. Among them, 20 shivering passengers and crewmen who were finally rescued more than 20 hours after they left the cruise ship. All were happy to be alive.
We made it. One way or another, we made it.
The survivors praised the efforts of the United States Coast Guard, but said some of the lifeboats from the cruise ship were either in disrepair or weren't properly equipped. Lifeboat engines didn't work, emergency radios weren't working, and some said at least one lifeboat didn't have a rudder. Survivors arriving on the cutter Boutwell joined other passengers and crewmen who had been airlifted to Sitka.
If I can have your attention for just a moment, please. Tomorrow, we'll take you around to give you clothing and shoes.
The survivors lost everything they had.
We kind of left everything we owned behind. It was an extensive cruise, and most people had all of their jewelry and clothing and things for a month or two.
John Gorkos from Huntington Beach, California, was separated from his wife and children. They ended up on the oil tanker that went to Valdez. The cruise ship company is making plans to fly all of the survivors to Seattle, and some may begin heading there sometime tonight. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Sitka, Alaska.
Good morning, Bakersfield, California. It's today, Monday, October 6th. Time now to take a look at the latest news. And there is some good news this morning. More than 500 people, many of them elderly, are now back on land after abandoning the burning cruise ship, the Prinsendam, in the Gulf of Alaska. More on the heroic, dramatic rescue from David Burrington.
For most of the passengers and crew, this was the dismal end of a luxury cruise to the Orient. But it could have been a lot worse. All aboard the supertanker Williamsburg were in good shape. As the tanker docked in the port of Valdez, an ambulance was standing by, but it was not needed, Coast Guard officials said.
How you folks doing, okay?
Most of the passengers are elderly and had to be helped. Many had no coats, and there were few umbrellas for the rain. Cameramen were kept at a distance as the passengers came off the ship some 36 hours after their ordeal began. Some had spent up to 15 hours in lifeboats. There was more delay here as officials pondered what to do about the Dutch crewmen who had no visas to enter the United States. The passengers spent the night in Valdez, jamming up all hotels in this tiny town. From here, everyone's to be taken to Anchorage for some rest. Then they'll start heading back to their hometowns to tell friends and neighbors of their extraordinary adventure. David Burrington, NBC News in Valdez.
And in the Seattle studios of King Television this morning, we have NBC's Bill Sternoff with two of the survivors, Louise Steele of Worcester, Massachusetts, Bill Powell of Laguna Beach, California. Good morning and welcome home.
Good morning, Tom. I guess first we should say NBC News, Mrs. Steele, has located your husband in Valdez. He did arrive on the oil tanker, and you, however, were flown out of the Gulf of Alaska. How is it that each and every one of you managed to be lifted out of that Gulf?
Well, it was done by the Coast Guard, as you know, and they took us out in baskets, one at a time. They lifted us into the plane. And the reason I was separated from my husband is because the plane was running out, the Coast Guard plane was running out of fuel and had to head back for their station. So my husband was left behind and was eventually taken aboard the freighter.
Were you scared when you left the ship? This happened in darkness in the middle of the night.
I must say I was not frightened, and people didn't appear to be frightened.
Nobody panicked?
Nobody panicked.
Nobody cried?
Nobody cried.
How so?
It's a very strange thing I don't understand.
What were the sea conditions there, and how did they change as the day went on?
When we left the ship at approximately 4 in the morning, the sea was quite calm. But after we'd been in the water for about 3 hours, and before we saw any help in sight, the seas got heavier again.
Mr. Powell, this happened just 3 days into a tour that might have taken more than a month, at a cost of $6,000 to $12,000 for each of the participants. What if this would have happened on the 4th day, or the 5th day, or the 6th day out? What then?
Well, I can only tell you what the Coast Guard mentioned to me, that it could have been completely disastrous if we had been any further out.
That's because you would have been completely out to sea.
Right. As it was, we were 150 miles out from the land.
Did you find this a scary experience?
Yes. It was something that I don't care to repeat ever again. It was scary.
You were on the Coast Guard cutter the Boutwell, which lifted out the last people from the Gulf.
That's right.
And then you were taken into Sitka, Alaska.
That's correct.
We hear that there was some sort of commotion on the ship, that some of the crewmen seemed to rush the lifeboats. Is that right?
Well, I don't really care to elaborate on that. There was, well, you see, there was a staff and there were crewmen. The staff was Dutch, the crewmen were Indonesian. And I think possibly the Indonesians were scared.
Mrs. Steele, many of the people on this ship were elderly. Didn't this work a particularly difficult time for them?
You might have thought so, but everybody seemed to manage very well, even the people who were in wheelchairs.
There you were in the Gulf of Alaska. It was dark, it was cloudy, it was foggy, the seas were growing rough, and suddenly you saw the oil tanker.
Well, that wasn't until we had been in the water for 3 hours.
What was your reaction?
Well, it was like seeing a mirage, a sparkling, beautiful sight. But it turned out to be a very large tanker.
Well, you're both very lucky, of course, to be here, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Tom?
Thank you, Bill, and once again to Mrs. Steele and Mr. Powell, welcome home. Some of the lifeboats, they pass the time by singing, you guessed it, row, row, row your boat, just to keep going through the stormy seas.
What was to have been a voyage to the South Seas ended suddenly in frigid Alaskan waters early Saturday morning. Irv Chapman has details.
The Dutch cruise vessel Prinsendam, after sightseeing in Alaskan waters, headed across the Pacific when its engine room caught fire. The fire spread, the ship was ordered abandoned. Passengers took to lifeboats in the bitter chill, monitored by Coast Guard helicopters. An oil tanker, which had loaded up in Alaska and was headed south to Texas, diverted to the scene, rescued nearly 400 of the passengers, brought them to the oil port of Valdez. A smaller group was brought by Coast Guard cutter to the port of Sitka. Some of the passengers spent 10 hours in lifeboats in the choppy seas and 24 more hours in the overcrowded crew quarters of the oil tanker. One young passenger broke his leg in the evacuation.
I was climbing up the side of the ship and slammed my ankle against the ship and I fell.
Their journey to the sunny seas of Southeast Asia aborted. The passengers will now be flown home. The cause of the fire will be investigated after it can be put out. Irv Chapman, ABC News.
This is Eyewitness News with Fahey Flynn, Larry Moore for Joel Daly, Steve Deschler, Tim Weigel, and the Eyewitness News team.
Her passengers and crew are all miraculously safe tonight, but the Dutch cruise ship Prinsendam may be doomed. ABC's Stephen Gear has the latest on the weekend fire at sea.
Coast Guard fire control experts had hoped to board the ship today in an effort to put out the fire, but high seas delayed that operation, and the Coast Guard now reports that one of the ship's fuel tanks has exploded.
This is the oil tanker Williamsburg as it sailed into the harbor at Valdez, Alaska late yesterday. After it docked, it was 3 hours before the 280 passengers from the Prinsendam were led from the tanker onto waiting buses for the ride into Valdez, where housing and motels had been arranged. Leading the impromptu welcome committee at one motel was Bob Bassett, a local politician, who seemed surprised at the good humor of the passengers. Many spoke easily about what they had been through.
I was 12 hours in the lifeboat. Paul was about 15 hours. He stayed on with the men to help the women aboard the airlift. I got to tell you, the U.S. of A. is just a great place. The Air Force, the Canadians, the Coast Guard.
The tanker.
Just seeing them after being out in that lifeboat in the dark.
Was it cold out there?
Oh, in Alaska Sound, yes.
Stephen Gear, ABC News, Valdez, Alaska.
This is the international edition of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
It was the kind of drama about which sagas of the sea are written.
The weekend rescue of more than 500 passengers and crew from the flaming cruise ship Prinsendam. That adventure in the snarled and yelping seas of the Gulf of Alaska after fire broke out in the engine room is being called the greatest single ship rescue in recent history. All aboard were accounted for with no major injuries after rescue efforts led by the Coast Guard, and one rescuer called that a miracle. Bernard Goldberg reports.
The fire that broke out before dawn on Saturday was still smoldering below deck today. The 427-foot Dutch liner, the Prinsendam, still dead in the water. Yesterday, smoke was pouring out of the ship, which is drifting, listing slightly, but the hull is in good shape, and unless the weather worsens significantly, probably not in danger of sinking. Today, the ship's captain, Cornelius Vabeka, a Dutchman, and other officials of the Holland-American line boarded a helicopter en route to the Prinsendam, where Captain Vabeka was once again to take command. But the waves were too high, they did not board the ship, which soon will be towed southward towards Washington State for repairs. Meanwhile, in Sitka, a small fishing village nestled beneath the mountains of southern Alaska, a high-ranking official of the cruise line, a former captain of the Prinsendam himself, talked for the first time about what went wrong.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas, and from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room. At least that's my best guess.
The stark realization is that this cruise that ended in disaster might have become a far worse tragedy with many deaths at sea. And today, officials of the cruise line began assessing the damage to determine if they can salvage the ship, restore it, and once again take it out to sea as a luxury liner. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Sitka, Alaska.
In those horror-filled moments when fire swept the Prinsendam, two elementary sayings of the sea came into conflict. Women and children first, and every man for himself. And today, passengers mixed their praise for rescue efforts by the Coast Guard and others with criticism of the crew's behavior. Susan Spencer reports from Valdez, Alaska.
Valdez's main department store was doing a booming business this morning as Prinsendam passengers, most still clad in their lifeboat clothes, tried to make themselves presentable for the flight home, courtesy Holland America Lines.
Do you have anything else? I mean, I'd like your pantsuit better.
At the nearby Totem Inn, there were but two topics of conversation: what happened on the Prinsendam, and how did I ever make it?
Well, I wasn't really frightened. We have done a lot of trusting in our lives. And the only time it was really terrifying was when we were hitting the side of the ship and we thought that the boat would turn over, because the water at 44 degrees or something like that, you don't last very long, and the waves were so high.
There were mixed reviews for the captain's performance through all this, but no kudos at all for the 106 Indonesian crew members, who passengers said clambered into lifeboats first.
There was a bunch of fellas from the band on the boat, and they were all lined around the rail where they shouldn't be. And then when he said to abandon ship, a bunch of the crew members, this is the Indonesian crew members, and this band bunch, they just jumped right in and nobody else could get near the boat. When the helicopters eventually came, which was about 11 hours later, you know who was first off the boat. And we couldn't keep them, and so Cora said, let them go, we're better off without them, get them out of here. That was the band, this crew and the band. But it was terrible. They were walking all over the little old ladies, and it was a shame.
The flares and things are either, whether they're written in English and they can't read it, and they didn't know how to use them anyway. They had had no training in this. They didn't know how to release us from the boat. They didn't know how to start the oars.
The crew, busy on the town volleyball court, showed no sign of concern over all this criticism, nor would anyone talk about the Prinsendam incident. By the time the passengers arrived at the Valdez airport for the last leg of their journey, they seemed equally uninterested in dissecting it. As one man said, let them figure it out. I just want to get out of here. Susan Spencer, CBS News.
United States Coast Guard involved in 2 dramatic rescue operations. In the biggest, every one of the 519 passengers and crew members from the burning luxury liner Prinsendam were rescued from lifeboats off the coast of Alaska. And that was the largest single successful operation of its kind in modern history. And with all lives now safe, the Coast Guard tried to drop firefighters onto the hulk from helicopters. That did not work. The Prinsendam is listing to starboard, but apparently not in danger of sinking, and when weather conditions calm down, then crews will be able to get on board. The last survivor spent 21 hours in a lifeboat, bouncing around by stormy, icy seas, trying to fight seasickness, and a report on that now from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
The 18 passengers and 2 U.S. Air Force frogmen were brought ashore with other survivors at Sitka, with the story of how they'd floated at sea for almost 22 hours. The 2 young paramedics had originally been dropped into the lifeboat to help the frightened passengers. Their rescue efforts were aborted, however, by a mechanical failure of lifting gear. The helicopter never came back. The full search effort was declared complete on Saturday evening. It was resumed, though, when the Air Force realized that their 2 men were missing. The Boutwell spotted flares fired by the frogmen from the lifeboat in the early hours of Sunday morning. The passengers were crediting the frogmen with saving their lives.
And they knew what to do because people were cold and very sick. And they were just great. The last one. They were just, I can't say enough for the Air Force. They were fabulous.
Number 6. Yeah. Number 6. What were conditions like on the boat?
Very crowded and everybody was very sick. So it was called the 20-foot waves and it was difficult.
Then rain broke out.
But everybody was terrific. Everybody kept their heads together and we're all here. And hi.
We all made it.
Yeah.
What's your name? Yeah. You don't wish to talk. The captain of the Prinsendam was among those brought ashore, but he, like all of the ship's crewmen, were banned from talking to the news media. Holland America Line officials are meeting here today to assess the legal implications of the disaster and to consider the problem of how to salvage the wreck of their $50 million cruise vessel. Colin Hof, CBC News, Sitka, Alaska.
This is NBC Nightly News with John Chancellor in New York. And tonight's special segment, Wayne Newton and the Law.
A Coast Guard officer called it a miracle, the rescue without loss of life, without serious injury of 533 people from lifeboats in the Gulf of Alaska. A fire had forced them off their cruise ship, Prinsendam, and they had bobbed about in the cold and wet for hours, one boatload for 17 hours, before helicopters found them. Today they were in port, safe and warm, in Sitka and Valdez. A report from David Burrington.
The abandoned liner still smoldered today. Coast Guard fire experts tried to board it to decide if it could be towed to port. Most of the passengers and crew arrived in Valdez last night on this tanker, and with the rescue completed, there are many questions. Why no sprinkler system in the engine room? Why so much confusion? Many of those rescued are elderly and spent some 15 hours in lifeboats in bad weather. And doctors were astonished they came through the ordeal as well as they did.
Welcome to Valdez, Alaska.
All were thankful to be alive, but some were bitter.
The lifeboats were overcrowded, terribly overcrowded, and that was frightening because we saw the capacity is 48, and some of the boats had 60, 80 people on them.
The crew was not of any help, and so I was a rower, and there were other women and a few men in the center, and we just rowed for our lives. I really thought at that point we wouldn't make it.
Other complaints? After hours on deck, they were told the fire was under control. Then suddenly abandoned ship. Crewmen were housed separately in a local high school. They did not care to answer questions. Passengers accused some of pushing ahead into the lifeboats, and a number of passengers say they will sue the line for damages. Of all the passengers and crew arriving here, only 15 were examined at the hospital and only 4 kept overnight. Nothing serious except the financial loss, symbolized for one man by his room key.
It doesn't look like much, but to us it's worth thousands and thousands of dollars. That's what it cost us. Everything we had is completely lost. What I'm wearing is what I have left.
This morning, the rescued passengers had a leisurely breakfast. Some went shopping for clothes to tide them over. Then they were flown to Anchorage to catch planes back home. David Burrington, NBC News, Valdez.
The luxury liner Prinsendam is reported burning fiercely tonight in the Gulf of Alaska. but all of its passengers are headed home. Tonight, we'll focus on the Prinsendam Rescue, and we'll talk with survivors who just reached Seattle a short time ago. And on day 338 of the hostage crisis, the Speaker of Iran's parliament talks about conditions for the hostages' release.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. The ship had been headed for Singapore on a 30-day vacation cruise. Now, she lies crippled in the Gulf of Alaska. A Coast Guard firefighting crew is aboard a nearby cutter, but intense heat aboard the liner Prinsendam has made it impossible to board, too dangerous to try and bring the fire under control. But all things considered, this is an extraordinary story. Amid reports that some crew members pushed passengers aside to board lifeboats first, amid complaints that the lifeboats were inadequately equipped, the conclusion of the story is nevertheless one of great success. All 533 passengers and crew are safe. It is, we thought, a saga well worth telling in some detail. Here, first, from Alaska, is correspondent Stephen Gear.
It happened 120 miles out in the Gulf of Alaska. The fire in the engine room of the luxury liner had broken out late Friday night, and by Saturday morning, the cruise from Vancouver to the Orient was over. Abandon ship was the order, and the massive air-sea operation was underway. For hours, Coast Guard helicopters and rescue teams of U.S. and Canadian armed forces hoisted the 533 passengers and crew members from the lifeboats. Some of the first of those to reach land were taken by helicopter to the rescue center at Yakutat.
Was there any panic? Was anybody frightened?
No, well, we were frightened, but there was no panic. Everybody was very cooperative. There wasn't a jam to get on the boats. There wasn't a jam to get on the helicopters. And I love the United States government. Thank you.
What are you going to do now?
I'd like to get a pair of bloomers. I didn't come off with them.
Now, are you going to try to
go home. I want to see my daughter and son and my grandchild.
Most of the passengers and crew ended up on the 1,000-foot oil tanker Williamsburg, which headed for its familiar port of Valdez at the terminus of the Alaska pipeline. The Williamsburg docked just before dark on Sunday, and 3 hours later the passengers left the ship and by bus were taken to several motels in Valdez to spend the night. Many of the passengers appeared to be delighted despite their ordeal.
I was 12 hours in the lifeboat. Paul was about 15 hours. He stayed on with the men to help the women aboard the airlift. I got to tell you, the U.S. of A. is just a great place. The Air Force, the Canadians, the Coast Guard. Just seeing them after being out in that lifeboat in the dark.
Was it cold out there?
Oh, and Alaska Sound, yes.
A number of the Prinsendam's passengers are elderly and had a frightening experience.
Terrible, so bitterly cold. Can't imagine how cold it was. I had this and a sweater and a coat, and I had to sit against two rails with the wind blowing on my back the whole time, and part of the time, great waves, salt waves, blowing up into our face.
The evening in Valdez, including for many refreshments in a warm and cozy bar, and dinner in a pleasant, comfortable dining room, helped ease some of the anxieties, as did telephone calls to relatives. This North Carolinian with 23 great-grandchildren is telling her daughter about her departure from a lifeboat.
And they picked me up, and instead of picking me up, they picked me down, and I went in the ocean. Everybody else got well, except me. It's the truth. I'm the only one who dropped the ocean.
When morning came to Valdez today, with rain and fog, the adventure in Alaska was nearly over. Bussed to the Valdez airport, the passengers who had abandoned belongings on the ship had a brief shopping fling. Then the first leg of the flight home, to Anchorage and then Seattle. Stephen Gear, ABC News, Anchorage, Alaska.
In a moment, a talk we had a few moments ago with two of the survivors of the Prinsendam just arrived in Seattle. Standing by now at the airport in Seattle, where they just arrived a short time ago, are two survivors of the Prinsendam, Mr. and Mrs. Bill and Sonna Chris of Toronto. First of all, let me welcome you both. You must be delighted to be sitting where you are this evening.
We are very much so. Thank you.
Mrs. Chris,
allow me to begin, if I may, with a rather frivolous question. What are you going to do on vacation next year?
This was an anniversary present for my husband, so I don't know what he's going to surprise me with next year.
Do this for me. Would you just describe those moments when you first realized what was going on the ship, and just kind of sketch in for us, if you would, the hours until you were rescued? Were you both together at all times?
Yes, we were, luckily. We were both together, and we just couldn't believe that this thing was happening. At first, it was just a routine call from the bridge on the intercom to that there was smoke in the engine room, and for us to put on something and go up into the lounge.
Yeah, the fire was under control.
And that the fire was under control, and that we wouldn't be gone very long, that we could go back to our cabins.
We didn't have no life jackets on. We'd have no clothes, just barely no shoes. We thought just going to be a thing to go up the lounge, come down again. When we got to the deck, I think it was about 2.5 hours later, and there was fire coming out of the floor.
And was there, Mrs. Chris, was there a sense of panic on board at this point,
No,
or just a sense of not knowing what was going on?
There was no panic. The passengers were responding to all the instructions, which were very little, and everything was very, very calm. We just did as we were told. We stood on deck. We always felt that it was going to be under control and that we would be returning to our cabins, because none of us were prepared. We had no life jackets. Some of us had no shoes. Ladies were in nighties. Men were in their boxer shorts, wrapped in blankets. We all expected at any moment we would be told, return to your cabin. The only time is when Bill saw this fire licking between the deck and the rails, and he told several of the deckhands, there's fire. They said, oh, it's nothing, it's asphalt burning. And finally, we yelled fire, and it was coming out of the dining room, and the window blew, and that's when we got scared and started pushing down the deck, and then the word came, into the life rafts, and that's when, and still at that time, people were not shoving and pushing or screaming or hysterical. It's amazing. You would have to have been there to see. People were calm. We got into these boats. They were lowered. We got out into the Gulf, and still there was no panic.
Now, we have heard some reports, Mrs. Chris, that members of the crew were among the first to get on board the lifeboats. I mean, in marked contrast to what one normally hears about...
Well, you see, there were several boats. We were on boat number 6.
The last boat.
And on our boat, we didn't see any of that.
How long, Mrs. Chris, were you on the lifeboat?
On the lifeboat, we were, I guess, I would think it was about 15 hours we were there.
It must have been terribly, terribly cold out there.
It was cold. We were throwing blankets, and we had the blankets around us, and they became very, very wet. The waves came with such force. They tell us now they were between 15 and 20 feet. They came with such force. I had my back to them, and they would slap you down, and you could taste the salt in the water. Bill was covering me with the blanket, and I'd look up and was seasick, but would look over my shoulder to see the blackness all around and just cover my head again, and we were quiet. And as long as we could hear the planes out there and the helicopters, you felt a sense of, well, someone was going to help you. You weren't alone.
But were the lifeboats well equipped? In other words,
no, they were not.
No, it's not what they told us in the drill. That all the things were on the lifeboat. There's nothing. There's no cover.
We didn't have flares. We didn't have a flashlight. There was no survival kit. There was nothing on the boats at all.
Well, what about food and water?
Nothing.
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 Did anyone...
But no, really, at that point, nobody cared about water but food, but anyway, there's nothing, just the survival.
We weren't hungry.
Nobody was hungry.
It was just we wanted to get out of there.
We just want to get out, and there's no fear for somebody getting hungry or nothing. There's nothing like that. Just the fact that the survival was number one,
But people on your boat, they behaved well during those 15 hours?
Yes, they did.
Very well.
You know, there was a time when the helicopter came, they said to us that we can only take 10 people out, and that's it. There's no panic. We all took our turn. My wife was number 10, I was number 9. My wife was number 9, I was number 10. And there was nobody pushing, they're trying to beat us to the thing. Everybody they behaved so well that it's unbelievable. And especially that the way the passengers behave. And we're the last people to leave that boat on the...
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Chris, you've been through an extraordinary experience, and I suppose the best thing I can say to both of you is we're terribly happy that you're well and safe, and happy anniversary to you.
Thank you very much. We really owe our lives to the U.S. Air Force and the Canadian Air Force. Yeah. Without them, we wouldn't be here today.
They really do seem to have covered themselves with glory, don't they?
They did, and the people at Yakata, the firemen there, they just went all out. We had, all our clothes were, well, what we had on was soaking wet, and they came up with old clothes for us, and hot coffee and soup and concern, and just took us into their hearts. And the people at Sitka, we just can't thank them enough.
This clothes is awfully secret. That's what they gave us. We didn't have nothing. This is not our clothes.
Well, that's really just grand. Next year, take it to the Grand Canyon, will you?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you both very much indeed. In a moment, we'll take a look at some disasters at sea that have had less fortunate results for their passengers and crews.
Coast Guard crews are keeping their distance from the burning luxury liner Prinsendam this morning. Firefighters planning to go aboard decided not to because of dense smoke, indicating the blaze that forced all aboard to abandon ship 3 days ago may have spread to the fuel tanks. The ship is still drifting aimlessly this morning in rough seas in the Gulf of Alaska. For the passengers, now safe, dry, and heading for home, it's a day for reflecting on new friends found and material goods lost. Susan Spencer reports.
The Prinsendam passengers allowed themselves a few sentimental moments in the Valdez Airport gift shop before leaving for Anchorage. A few moments at a place none of them ever expected to see just 3 days ago. They boarded the flight carrying their by now well-worn plastic shopping bags, the only luggage they've had since they fled the burning liner in the middle of the night. At Anchorage, Holland America officials passed out tickets to Seattle, forms asking, among other things, how much cash and what valuables they'd left on board, and some walking around money.
Yeah, that'll get me home, $40 cab fare. But what about from LAX to San Diego?
We're going to give you a ticket.
We just need a picture.
You're sure that?
And if we don't, we'll give you some more money.
Going over the details of the accident again and again seems to be a part of getting over it. That and sharing the experience with fellow passengers, the only ones who will ever really know what it was like. A lot of friendships were made on the rescue tanker Williamsburg.
When we were picked up, I had my nightgown on and a robe. They gave me the pants. Yes. That's what I said, souvenir.
The Prinsendam passengers will split up in Seattle to continue on home today. The cruise having been, just like the brochures always predict, an experience you'll never forget. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Anchorage, Alaska.
Fire is spreading on board the crippled luxury liner Prinsendam in the Gulf of Alaska tonight. Coast Guard officials say fire and smoke began billowing from the ship earlier this evening as the blaze spread to the liner's carpets and unused lifeboats. The Coast Guard says it will not fight that fire, but wait until it burns itself out and then decide whether the ship is worth saving. All 533 members of the ship's passengers and crew were evacuated without injury from the liner after a fire broke out in the engine room on Saturday.
Now, the 10 o'clock edition of News Center 5.
Good evening, I'm Jim Ruddle.
I'm Chuck Henry. The luxury liner Prinsendam is still burning tonight after smoldering, abandoned all day in the Gulf of Alaska. And the fire that routed some 533 passengers and crew members may soon reach the ship's fuel tanks. A miracle is what many call the safe evacuation of those passengers, some of whom said that the crew members were actually racing them for the lifeboats when the order came to abandon ship. Many of the passengers came ashore, leaving their personal belongings and clothing aboard ship.
Have left.
Wearing only what they had left. Only 4 passengers were hospitalized overnight in Alaska. The others are boarding planes to be flown to Seattle.
And the abandoned luxury liner Prinsendam is still adrift and burning off the Alaskan coast, bad weather preventing firefighters from going aboard. Passengers and crew, all rescued safely, have begun their journeys home, as Tom Shell reports.
Most of the passengers of the ill-fated ocean liner were flown into Seattle last night aboard chartered planes. The first plane from Sitka arrived in early evening with about 100 survivors aboard. They were quickly put onto buses and taken to nearby hotels, where their experience was relived and complaints compared.
The captain ought to be relieved of his command, because he didn't say abandon ship until the windows blew out and the flame came out on the deck where we were. We're still standing there on the deck. He hadn't even lowered the lifeboats. I was afraid we were going to drift and they might not find us. They didn't even have a flashlight on the damn thing. We were packed in there like sardines. You couldn't even move. There's so many people in it.
For many of the survivors, there was one more wait. Many families were separated during the rescue, and it was a night of reunion.
So happy to see you.
Many were counting the hours, about 67 since they'd been together. After a night's rest, it will be more travel for most, back home from vacation early, but thankful to be alive. Tom Shell, ABC News, Seattle.
After 7, as we've been hearing on the news, what is being called the greatest ship rescue in history took place in the Gulf of Alaska over the weekend. Over 450 people were brought safely to land after this Dutch cruise ship called the Prinsendam, which was on its way to the Orient, started a burn out of control on Saturday. This morning, the Jorkos family, Father John, Mother Ginny, and Jean and Sandy, their 2 children, they were all aboard the ship. They're joining us this morning live Eastern Time from KOMO-TV. That's our ABC station in Seattle, Washington. The Jorkos family were on a 2-month trip to the Far East. Instead, they will soon be on their way back to Huntington Beach in California. Good morning, John and Jean and Sandy and Ginny. Nice to have you with us. Welcome back from the Gulf of Alaska.
Good morning, David. We're awful glad to be here.
First of all, how are you all? Physically, mentally, emotionally? Are you all okay?
Physically, we're all fine, and we're very happy to be together, and we're glad to be heading home.
John, briefly, when did you first know about the fire, and what did you do about it?
Well, I had came down from the midnight buffet, and it was right about 12 o'clock, and I took off my clothes and got in bed, and Ginny smelled smoke, so I got up to investigate and couldn't find anything in the cabin, so I put on my pants and went out in the hall and discovered smoke out there.
What'd you do then?
Come back in the cabin, got dressed, and we went down to check the children.
Did you have any trouble getting down to the children?
Yes, the fire door was pulled across their corridor, and we had to go through a staff entrance, and it took a little time to locate that to get in.
Jean and Sandy, what was happening with you at the time?
Well, I was up on the deck when my dad came up with my sister, or my dad came up and asked me where my sister was, and I told him she was in the room.
And Sandy, were you okay in there? Were you trying to get out? What was happening with you?
Well, they just made the announcement, put something warm on that there was a fire, so I got dressed and I was walking out the door and my dad started grabbing me.
So you all got out on deck. What was it like on deck, John and Jenny? What was the attitude? What was going on out there?
Everybody was in good spirits, David, and we had been told that there was a fire that was under control and we should come up to the lounge, and when the cabin area cleared we could go back. That never happened. We didn't get to go back, and a lot of people left their life preservers and were dressed in bathrobes and pajamas and bedroom slippers. And
were there any announcements to the effect before people left their cabins they should, wear warm clothes and wear life preservers or bring them, anything of that nature?
There was nothing as to the life preservers. They did tell us to go up to the lounge, and
They told us to dress warmly.
They did?
Yeah.
No.
I did not hear that, David.
No, I did not.
I heard it. That's what got me dressed warm.
Right, so some heard it and some didn't. We just heard on a newscast just now, one man who was on the ship, interviewed in Seattle on our newscast this morning, said that the abandoned ship announcement didn't come until after fire had blown out the windows and there was fire on deck. In your judgment, do you think that announcement was made soon enough to abandon ship?
Yes, we had time to get off the ship, David, but I think there might have been some discrepancies in the way it was done.
Were you all frightened?
Well, once we knew we hit the boats, a lot of people had been cruising, and your chances 150 miles in the Pacific aren't very good in the high seas in boats.
How did the crew react? What was your feeling about how they did?
I was very displeased with the crew. I was very happy with the passengers. If they would have been as professional as the passengers, things would have been much better.
What do you mean?
Some of the seamen, the officers seemed to act fairly well and keep control of the situation. Some of the seamen crowded into the lifeboats and climbed over elderly women and men to get out of the lifeboats.
All right, you got on two different boats, John. You and Jenny were on one boat, Gene and Sandy on another. What kind of shape were the boats in?
Our boat, the propulsion system was half inoperable, and the rudder was not working.
And how many people were on your boat?
Over 100, David.
How many were supposed to be? What was the limit?
I think it was rated for, well, I'm not sure what it was rated. You probably could have got 60 in there and had adequate seating for everybody. We had people standing up and sitting on top of each other.
And what about your lifeboat, Sandy and Gene? How was it?
It was fine. We had a motor, it ran, and everything.
So yours was okay?
Yeah.
What was going through your minds as you were on those lifeboats?
We were just waiting for the ship because we had heard it was on its way, and I just wanted to make sure my parents were okay.
And parents, Jenny and John, how did you feel? You were separated from your children. What was going through your minds?
We was concerned about the kids getting off, and after, you know, when we started getting rescued ourselves, I wanted to make sure that Jenny got off.
How long were you in the boat, John?
We were in the boat from about 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and I got out at noon.
When did you get off, Jenny?
I was off at 10.
At 10?
Yes.
How'd you feel when Jenny got off the boat, John?
Oh, I kind of had a tear roll down my cheek, and I thought I'd never see him again.
And you did?
And I did, and I'm glad.
Any recommendations or thoughts about this, about how the ship was handled, about the whole process? Should there be an investigation of any kind? What are your feelings, John?
I think there definitely should be an investigation. I think the firefighting equipment was inadequate, the crew was inadequately trained, and there was some design deficiencies and maintenance problems with the lifeboats.
Have you heard who can or may or may not investigate?
I understand that the Coast Guard cannot order the investigation because of the place of the accident, but I'm sure if everybody requests it due to public opinion and what other channels are available, it'll take place.
What's this done to your relationship, the four of you? Brought you closer together?
You never appreciated so much, everybody.
Well, enjoy your trip back to Southern California.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
And thanks for joining us this morning. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jorkos family. All together and safe and on their way home. Next half hour, Alastair Cook will join us, and we'll also have more news and weather coming up in just a moment.
Good morning, and good morning to Orlando, Florida, the home of the mouse, as they say. It's today, Tuesday, October the 7th. The Coast Guard can only watch as the cruise ship, the Prinsendam, continues to burn and drift in the Gulf of Alaska this morning. Heavy black smoke is keeping anyone from boarding the luxury liner. At the same time, reunions continue among the passengers who abandoned her. Here's Bill Sternoff.
The first of two groups of survivors to reach Seattle came in from Sitka, Alaska.
The people were anxious to be reunited with friends and relatives who became separated Saturday during the day-long rescue at sea. Some survivors had been airlifted directly to Sitka or were taken there aboard a Coast Guard cutter. Others, put aboard an oil tanker, were taken to Valdez. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, and many said they wouldn't believe their loved ones were safe until they were back together.
My last name's Corey, and I'm trying to find my mother. I thought she'd be here.
The reunions came when the second group of survivors arrived shortly after midnight.
Here you are. Here's your son.
I have something for you.
Oh, really? I have something for you, too.
For Dick and Louise Steele, the reunion was a dream and the end of a nightmare.
The last I saw of Mrs. Steele was her disappearing into the helicopter in the baskets.
I just have the departure time of the next flight there. You can.
The Steeles and all the other survivors from the cruise ship Prinsendam were given hotel rooms and airline tickets, and most will leave for home this morning. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Seattle.
This is Tuesday morning, October 7th, and from CBS News in New York, here is Morton Dean.
Good morning. It's a good day for many survivors of this past weekend's near disaster at sea. A good day because they will be heading for home. Meanwhile, the ship they abandoned continues to burn, a ghost ship drifting with the sea, battered by the wind. We'll have details on those and other stories in the news. First, let's hear from Bernard Goldberg on what's happening to the Dutch liner, the Prinsendam.
For a while, it looked like the fire was dying out, and indeed it was. But late yesterday, something happened. Most likely, what few flames there were spread to the ship's fuel tanks, igniting them, resulting in a new fire. So today, the Prinsendam, which set out last week as a luxurious slow boat to China and other Asian ports, today the cruise ship remains dead in the water, going nowhere. The ship's captain, Cornelius Verbeke, a Dutchman, prepared yesterday to fly out to his ship to take command again. This time, however, the ship was to be towed southward toward Washington State for repairs. But Captain Verbeke had to return, high waves forcing postponement of the towing operation even before the new fire broke out. Earlier yesterday in Sitka, a small fishing village on the Alaskan Gulf, a former captain of the Prinsendam and now an official with the Holland America Line talked about the first fire last weekend that began in the engine room and forced more than 500 passengers and crew to abandon ship.
We closed it off and sealed it off right away, the engine room. Let in the gas, the fire extinguisher and CO2 gas, and from that time on, the fire in the engine room started simmering down. But of course there was heat conveyance from the engine room casing, and that must have caused maybe curtains or whatever in the dining room just by heat conveyance to catch fire, and that's how it got outside the engine room.
As for this new fire, it is not clear how long it will burn, but until it is out, the once luxury liner Prinsendam is just drifting in the Gulf of Alaska. Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Anchorage.
Now, News Center 5.
Good afternoon, I'm Joy Luloff. Coast Guard firefighters are getting ready to board the burning luxury liner Prinsendam today. A tugboat is in the Gulf of Alaska to tow the $25 million vessel into shore. Meanwhile, separated survivors from that weekend fire are finally getting back together. Here's a report.
The first of two groups of survivors to reach Seattle came in from Sitka, Alaska. The people were anxious to be reunited with friends and relatives who became separated Saturday during the day-long rescue at sea. Some survivors had been airlifted directly to Sitka or were taken there aboard a Coast Guard cutter. Others, put aboard an oil tanker, were taken to Valdez. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, and many said they wouldn't believe their loved ones were safe until they were back together.
My last name's Corey, and I'm trying to find my mother. I thought she'd be here.
The reunions came when the second group of survivors arrived shortly after midnight.
Here
Cornelius, here you are. Here's your son. Made it.
I have something for you.
Oh, really? I have something for you,
For Dick and Louise Steele, the reunion was a dream. From the cruise ship Prinsendam were given hotel rooms and airline tickets, and most will leave for home this morning. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, Seattle.
11 men have boarded the fire-ravaged cruise ship Prinsendam as it smolders adrift in the Gulf of Alaska. It's hoped they can attach a line from the vessel to a tug and tow the ship to dry dock in Portland, Oregon. Meanwhile, the 500 passengers evacuated when fire broke out last weekend began arriving home. Tim Malloy has more.
Pat, some bitter, some elated, all very tired. The survivors of the crisis at sea headed in different directions today, while in Alaska, the fight to save the ship continued.
The cruise ship Prinsendam continued to drift and burn today. With the largest, most successful maritime rescue of its kind completed, the Coast Guard and firefighters worked to save the $25 million vessel from sinking.
From the Alaskan coastal towns of Sitka and Valdez, the 519 weary passengers rescued at sea were flown south to Seattle, then put on connecting flights home.
It was a joyous reunion in New York tonight as 16 survivors of the near disaster came home. Jack Mallon, a veteran of hundreds of cruises, was aboard to perform magic for the passengers.
Was there cowardice or was it all heroism?
I don't think that you can say that. Maybe not seasoned people. No one was a coward. You can't be a coward.
Others saw the handling of the crisis differently. 2 Swiss passengers said the crew had no idea what to do when the fire broke out.
And they didn't even know how to let down the small boats, you know. We were shaken like this. I in the boats. Nobody was here. It was terrible.
I just felt that we would be saved, and
we never feared for our lives. We always felt that we would be saved.
The Coast Guard in Alaska reports tonight that those passengers who were hospitalized have checked out and headed for home. There were no serious injuries in the fire or in the rescue. Bill.
The Bon Voyage and Welcome Home celebrations weren't supposed to be quite so close together, but friends and family of Roy and Peggy Wolf band together anyway this evening to welcome home a couple whose plans for a 6-week cruise aboard the luxury liner Prinsendam were cut short. When did Peggy realize the vacation was turning sour?
I woke up choking on smoke. Actually, I think we were the first ones to be awakened, and we went up to the bridge, and Captain was walking around like he didn't know what was happening, and he didn't alert the other passengers for about a half an hour. And then we roamed around the deck for 5 hours, and they put us in lifeboats that didn't work. And we sat out there for 12 hours. And if it hadn't been for the Coast Guard and the Army and those young men that hauled us one by one, 400 out of those lifeboats, we wouldn't be here.
In most cases, a family that survives an incident such as this one would simply consider themselves lucky. But this family considers themselves doubly lucky because just 18 months ago, their condominium burned. Otis Buchanan, TV2 Eyewitness News, Metro Airport.
Reports tonight that the ship's lifeboats were inadequately equipped. Some of the 500 people forced to evacuate the ship Saturday when it caught fire in the Gulf of Alaska said the lifeboats did not have emergency flares or rudders. The owners say that's not true. About a dozen Detroiters were on the Prinsendam for a 30-day trip to the Orient. They were rescued by the Coast Guard and an oil tanker and then flown to Valdez, Alaska. They flew back to Detroit today, arriving just minutes ago at Metro Airport, and Channel 7's Steve Handelsman is there now, and he has this live action camera report. Stephen, what are they saying?
Well, Bill, first of all, it's a tumultuous scene here. I should set that for you before we get on, and you can hear yourself what they have to say. The flight just arrived from Seattle. It was delayed about 2 hours after all that these people have been through out in the Gulf of Alaska. Bad weather in Seattle, a 2-hour delay. They've just arrived here, and you can see there's a big celebration going on here. Right in here, I'm going to try to wade in and talk to Peggy Wolf. She's from Southfield. Mrs. Wolf, hi. Steve Handelsman from Channel 7. Everybody in Detroit wants to know what it was like, first of all, out there. Give me a brief description of your experiences.
I woke up about midnight choking on smoke, and we went out in the gangway. It was black with smoke, and so we were on the bridge deck, and we ran down to the bridge. And the captain was walking around like he didn't know what hit him.
There was no fire alarm or anything?
No fire alarm, nothing. No officers, no crew, no one to help us. And we were on the bridge for about a half an hour before he alarmed the other passengers. And then we wandered around the decks inside and outside for about 5 hours. Then they told us to get into lifeboats, and they didn't work.
What do you mean by didn't work? We've heard a lot of reports from...
The chains to get them down were going clunk, 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 and then suddenly, I don't know if they cut the ropes or what, we just fell in the water. And instead of having crew to row, the old passengers were rowing, and there were things that, you pull like this. Well, as we were going, the boat in front of us came down on top, and we thought we were going to be crushed to death, and we all flew to the bottom of the lifeboat.
Good Lord. How long were you in that boat?
12 hours.
And then picked up by helicopter, taken to Alaska. You don't seem much the worse for the wear. You're smiling.
I don't always look this way.
I'm going to go over and talk to your husband for a brief second, but it sure must be nice to have all these people come out and welcome you. Let me go find your husband over here. Thank you very much. That's Peggy Wolf. I'm going to go try to find Roy Wolf, who's right in here. Excuse me, please. Excuse me.
So we
Can you get a shot in there?
Disoriented, disorganized, and actually didn't know where our loved ones were.
Could you tell me about the crew a little bit?
Our crew was primarily Indonesian, and the officers were Dutch. The captain was Dutch. Our boat commander in the lifeboat was an Indonesian. His assistant was an American who took control eventually because the Indonesian didn't speak English, nor did he understand English.
Mr. Wolf, were you satisfied with the way the crew behaved during this disaster?
Not particularly, no. There was many things about it that, in reflection, I disliked.
Tell us some of them now.
Well, as I was telling this gentleman, the lifeboats were poorly equipped for a dangerous rescue mission because we didn't have a proper rescue type equipment such as radio transmitters, flares, food, water, even flashlights or lighting gear. And as it got darker, it was impossible to let anyone know where you were.
Spokespeople for the line are saying today that the fact that nobody lost his life in this is proof enough that things were done at least reasonably well. What do you say to that?
Well, that's great. I agree to that. However, we were on deck standing by, my wife in her nightgown, me in my robe and slippers, for 3 hours. They had told us on 2 occasions that there was a small fire, it was under control, not to be concerned, but to stand by. And had we known that it was as serious as it was, we'd have probably dressed warmer, and we might have picked up some of our valuables. However, we stood out there for, I'd say, a good 3 hours, and then they gave us the notice to abandon ship. The day before, we had a boat drill, and the drill wasn't anything like the abandonment. Nobody knew where the hell they were supposed to go, where to sit, how many were supposed to be in each lifeboat, who was to command it. So, in answer to your question, I was displeased.
Bet it's glad to be back in Michigan, isn't it?
It's 100% glad to be back and home and feet on dry ground. Right.
Just out of curiosity.
Thank you very much. That's Roy Wolf from Southfield, the husband of Peggy Wolf, who you saw just a short time ago. They're not the only ones who flew in on the flight that just arrived here in Metro. There are others. I'm sure you're going to want to hear their story, so I'll stick around here, Bill, and I'll try to put together a report for the 11 o'clock news. Back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good to have all those folks from this area back and all the others on board that boat back safely as well.
No question. Thank you, Phil.
In very rough waters with 20-foot swells in cold, cold weather. And then being told you have to abandon ship and leave everything behind. And that's exactly what happened to the two people that are with me this morning. We have Peggy and Roy Wolf with us, and we welcome you here. And thank you very much for coming this morning. I know this situation has thrown your life into complete turmoil. It has just changed many things that normally would happen to you. I take it this was a trip you've planned for, you were looking forward to, having a good time, and all of a sudden, everything just stops. You lose everything. You have people like me calling you, asking you to be on television. And it must have been an incredible experience. What was that like? How did you first know there was a fire on board?
I woke up choking on smoke.
Was this late at night? Would this
I think between 12:30 and 1 in the morning. And I tried to rouse Roy. He'd been sick all the day and night before. And he was a little hesitant about getting up. And when we finally discovered, you know, we had no lights, no power in our room at all. And we got out in the hall, and that was filled with smoke. We just ran,
How did you, when you first developed a sense of smoke or whatever it was, how long had you been out to sea?
We left Vancouver Tuesday, and this was actually like Friday night.
Just after midnight Friday.
So you went out into the hallway, and you saw all the smoke?
In a raincoat and shoes.
And nothing, just...
Nothing else, that's it.
And then you went and got him up?
No, I got him up.
No, she shook me about 12:45, 1 o'clock, and said, Roy, do you smell smoke? And I said, leave me alone, I haven't been feeling well, forget it, let me sleep. And she kept shaking me, smoke. So I said, okay, I'll get up and check. And I put on my robe and slippers. Peg put on what she had, a raincoat and slippers.
Gee whiz.
And we opened the gangway, the doorway to the aisle gangway, and there were 2 or 3 other couples out there dressed like us, sniffing, wondering if they smelled smoke. And then we agreed amongst ourselves something was burning. At that point, we started going toward the stern of the boat, which is the normal pathway to get to the elevators or the stairway or the decks. And you have to open like a fire door to get through. And when we opened it, we got a blast of smoke. So we slammed it shut and then walked toward the front of the boat.
Now, had you heard any alarms? Anybody come knock on your doors at all?
Nothing.
Anybody been around or anything? Okay.
Nothing.
All right.
And we were living on the bridge deck. We never go toward the fore part of the boat because that's where the helmsman and navigator, captain are, but we wound up on the bridge. And at that point, everybody on the bridge looked stupefied. But there was somebody walking around with an orange life preserver under his arm, an officer. I'm rather vocal. And I said, what are you doing with a life preserver? And at that point, they asked us to step down a little stairway to the lower deck, telling us that these people have work to do. Please step down here and stand fast, which us 8 or 10 people did. And maybe 30 or 40 minutes later, we heard an announcement that there had been a small fire, but it was under control and nothing to be concerned about, but everybody stay where they are. Which we did on a dark, cold night on a deck, waiting, and possibly an hour and a half later, I can only estimate the time.
Still dressed the way you were?
Yes, still, about 8 of us. An announcement came that they were going to lower lifeboat number 1 to receive a pump from the Coast Guard air helicopter and maybe some carbon dioxide just as a preventive measure in case the fire should reoccur.
Do you have any idea how much time was spent from the time you first awoke and sensed the smoke and woke Rory up, went out into the gangway, got up on deck, to when you actually were lowered in a lifeboat?
5 hours.
5 hours? You were kept standing around?
Milling around. Just, you know, people were just... No one really got terribly upset. I think the reason we were all saved, the composure of the passengers, and of course, you know, the fantastic help that we got from the Coast Guard and Army.
You have a lot of good things to say about the Coast Guard.
We have
No, the Coast
everything.
Guard, you can't say enough for the Canadian Coast Guard, the American Coast Guard, the Air Force, and the Williamsburg and its captain. That was the largest oil tanker that the United States has, who happened to be in the general area. But it took them, I guess, about 3.5 to 4 hours to get to where our last known position was. But the lifeboat Peggy and I were on, number 5, was the first to be lowered, and we probably drifted the furthest away.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kick you. What was it like when they actually said abandon ship and you climbed into a lifeboat? Did you believe that was happening? I mean, was this just a movie?
At no time did I think that, you know, that we were going to stay on that ship. I mean, I was just waiting, you know, for orders to get in the lifeboat.
Oh, you really expected to go in the lifeboat?
Absolutely, because the smoke never stopped. It just kept bellowing out.
We never saw flames, but we saw a lot of smoke. But I'll tell you, we were, as far as survival kit on our lifeboat was concerned, very poorly prepared. And as far as able-bodied seamen, we had like cooks and busboys who are actually handling the lifeboats. I can only speak for Lifeboat 5 that we were on. Later we got hearsay from other people who had equal comments to state.
Now you've lost everything that you had with you.
Everything we had with us, yes.
And that ship is now 9,000 feet below water, from what I understand.
Yes.
And you've lost it all, so now you have to try and get little things like driver's license and keys and all these
Well,
little
you know, when this happens, when you're in that lifeboat, all you're thinking about is, oh, if I can only survive, if I can only, you know, nothing matters. But now you miss your things.
Now we're back to
now the things are important again. Yeah.
Mementos and little credit cards, and as you say, driver's license, and effects that you took with us to remember.
I'm going to run out of time here. Has this changed your lives? Do you think differently about life and people now?
No.
No?
Not differently. We think stronger about some people. The Alaskan people were wonderful. They opened their homes and their hearts and did whatever they could to help us. Peggy and I were over 1,000 miles apart. After we were rescued, neither one of us knew where the other was. But we were informed that all survived, so we knew she and I were safe.
But I think the bottom line of the whole rescue was the Williamsburg. If it hadn't been there, because it was the only way the helicopters could land.
But I must say before we finish that, in my opinion, the ship's company was very non-professional, very poorly equipped, and very poorly provisioned for survival.
I have to stop here. Peggy and Roy, well, thank you for taking time out of your lives and coming here and telling us about that. It's nice to have you back with us.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
We have more for you. That's right, Masterful Tapes Tries. Next, stay with us. Tapestries. I couldn't read that.
Walter Jacobson, Harry Volkman, Johnny Morris, Susan Anderson, and Gene Siskel with the Channel 2 News at 5.
In the Gulf of Alaska tonight, Coast Guard firefighters are hoping to board the burning ocean liner Prinsendam. A tugboat has arrived on the scene, and there is hope that the fire can be fought while the ship is being towed to port. Meanwhile, a spokesman for Holland American Cruises is denying claims that the ship's lifeboats were unsafe. All of the 533 passengers and crew were rescued. 3 Chicago area passengers returned home tonight, and we met one of them at the airport.
They told us that there was a slight fire in the engine room and to put on something warm and come up to the lounge so that they could remove the smoke.
And what was getting in the lifeboats like?
Well, we got in the, 3 hours later, we got in the lifeboats at 4 in the morning. It was pitch dark. We were in them 9-10 hours before we were picked up. The helicopters took us out by little wire baskets. They pulled us up out of the lifeboats, and then they took us to the tanker. We were on the tanker 2 days, and the crew was absolutely marvelous. The helicopters were absolutely marvelous. We had no one was lost. 510 people were rescued.
Bill Curtis, Walter Jacobson, John Coughlin, Johnny Morris with Chicago's #1 news. Channel 2, the 10 o'clock news.
In Chicago tonight, some people who could have become victims of a disaster at sea are home safe and sound. The residents, along with some 500 other people, were on the luxury Dutch liner that caught fire off the Alaskan coast this past weekend. The story of their dramatic rescue now from Phil Walters.
At least 4 Chicagoans, all of them elderly, were aboard the Prinsendam when the fire broke out. Roused from their cabin beds, forced to huddle on the ship's deck for hours, and then to abandon ship in lifeboats, overcrowded and ill-equipped. Mrs. George Frerer of Oakbrook remembered as she returned home tonight.
Rudders were broken, they were not equipped properly, and we just floated around and were submerged by waves. If it hadn't been for the helicopters and the Coast Guard, we wouldn't have been here today.
So tonight the passengers are finally in their own homes with the families they must have thought so desperately about in those hours at sea. The adventure is over, and the telling of it begins.
We got the word to abandon ship, and it's all hearsay. There's no officer.
No announcement.
No announcement.
This word came through the crowd to abandon ship?
To abandon ship. To abandon ship. Some people didn't even know what that meant.
Donald and Elsa Miller, back at home tonight in Burr Ridge, remember that as they abandoned ship, there was panic not among the passengers, but among the crew.
Fighting passengers to
Absolutely.
They did.
Fighting to get on. Push them aside and jump over the...
Well, what did the passengers do when the crew started doing this?
Nothing.
They had these older people who couldn't push back.
So we all just shut up and just sat there and were saying our prayers, you know. But after they were on the boat, the lifeboat, they just sat there. They were, God, these kids were barefoot. They had no clothes on. They were more scared than we were, I think.
Well, I think we're just so happy to be here that you can't bother being, you know, mad at anybody or anything. It's just too good to be home.
No, she said, there is no room for anger tonight. Philip Walters, Channel 2 News in Burr Ridge.
This is Wednesday morning, October 8th, and from CBS News in New York, here is Morton Dean.
The captain of the luxury liner Prinsendam, he was the last to abandon ship when it caught fire Saturday, has become the first to reboard it. He did so yesterday to help snuff out the remaining hot spots today. The ship itself is under tow today from the Gulf of Alaska to Portland, Oregon for repairs. And that's our news for this morning. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow morning, and have a good day.
The smoldering luxury liner Prinsendam is being towed toward the Alaskan coast this morning. The blaze that broke out on the Prinsendam last weekend forced more than 500 passengers and crew to abandon ship, all rescued.
Good morning, Yuma, Arizona. It's today, Wednesday, October the 8th.
Still musing over the miracle in the Gulf of Alaska, doctors say another 8 hours, a few hundred miles further out to sea, and half of the 533 passengers and crew of the Prinsendam would have died. The fact that most of the passengers were elderly probably saved lives because older people are less likely to panic.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
The captain of the stricken Dutch cruise ship Prinsendam today led a boarding party onto the still burning ship in the Gulf of Alaska. They plan on getting a line from the ship to a tug which would tow the Prinsendam to dry dock in Portland, Oregon. Clear skies and calmer seas buoyed hopes for the ship. The Coast Guard said there is no sign of the oil fires feared earlier.
Coast Guard firefighters hope to board the burning Dutch luxury liner Prinsendam today and have a tugboat tow it to Portland, Oregon. A Coast Guard spokesman says the black smoke and flames on the ship are from burning carpet and not endangering the ship's fuel tanks. The passengers rescued from the ship arrived in Seattle yesterday. Bob Brannon has more.
The first 100 rescued passengers touched down at SeaTac Airport a few minutes before 8 o'clock on a chartered Alaska Airlines jet from Sitka. As they emerged from the plane, they looked weary. One man had to be helped down the steps, but no one was reported injured in any way. The jet was chartered by West Tours Travel Agency in Seattle, the local representative of the cruise line, Holland America. The passengers didn't feel like talking to the news media immediately after they got off the plane. What it looked like they needed was a good night's sleep. The passengers were taken to 4 hotels near the airport.
About 25 came here to the SeaTac Hyatt, where most were tired but talkative and very happy to be back in the lower 48.
It was a harrowing experience, but it was remarkable. The Coast Guard, I can't say too much for the Coast Guard, the United States Coast Guard in Alaska, their efficiency when you're on that choppy water and the waves are going over you, and you see that whirly-bird overhead, and they're lowering the basket, and the thing is swinging back and forth, and you say, dear God, don't let it go into the propellers. And they knew just what they were doing. I came off of the helicopter that picked me up with a nightie, no underwear, pair of shoes, no socks, and a little robe. And they took us in, and they bought me this pretty outfit and a raincoat, and I'm just glad to be in Seattle.
Some of the people on the earlier flight had been separated from their spouses, who were coming on the later flight from Anchorage. That was the case with Sally Solomon and with Ed Harrison from Los Angeles. His wife was on the later flight, but on hand to greet him was his daughter Kathy and son-in-law Jim. Ed Harrison was asked where he got the T-shirt that had Seattle printed on it.
Dave, they were very nice to us. They gave us all a T-shirt and brought us home.
What else are you wearing?
I got my pajamas on. You know, I got that thing. That's the longest shorts anybody ever had on. Gee whiz, you know?
But daughter Kathy said it was no laughing matter when she heard her parents were on board the doomed cruise ship.
Devastated. Just devastated. How do you feel now? Very relieved.
Relief was widespread among the passengers, who had great thanks for the Coast Guard, the people of Sitka and Valdez, and for just being alive. Bob Branham, Channel 7 Eyewitness News, SeaTac.
Coast Guard firefighters hope to board the burning Dutch luxury liner Prinsendam today and have a tugboat tow it to Portland, Oregon. A Coast Guard spokesman says it has been determined that black smoke and flames coming from the ship are from burning carpets and are not endangering the ship's fuel tanks. Passengers rescued from the burning ship arrived in Seattle last night. Although the rescue mission was called a success, some passengers criticized the Prinsendam's preparations for a disaster. They said lifeboats were inadequately provisioned and badly maneuvered by crewmen.
Families who were separated when they left the burning cruise ship Prinsendam in the Gulf of Alaska have been reunited in Seattle. Now, many are charging that the ship's crew knew little about safety measures and lifeboat procedures. The ship itself still is afloat off Alaska, heavy smoke pouring from its decks.
The Dutch cruise ship, the Prinsendam, is drifting helplessly in the Gulf of Alaska in seas too stormy for the Coast Guard to put firefighters aboard her. Most of the rescued passengers, meantime, have arrived in Seattle for joyful reunions with family and friends. They were given clothing and airplane tickets home and hotel rooms, a happy ending considering the danger they were in when the ship caught on fire on Saturday.
Most of the passengers rescued from the crippled luxury liner Prinsendam over the weekend arrived in Seattle last night on a flight from Alaska. The cruise ship still burning in the Alaskan Gulf.
Well, the drama of a rescue at sea is just about over tonight for 4 Texans from the town of Grenada. They were aboard that Dutch ocean liner, the Prinsendam, over the weekend when fire hit the engine room, forcing everyone into lifeboats in the Gulf of Alaska. Tonight, they are arriving at this moment at Houston's Intercontinental Airport. A total of 6 Texans were on board that ship. Earlier today, a Coast Guard helicopter hovered over the stricken ship and dropped the captain, Cornelius Wabiki, back aboard. He is now trying to string a tow line to pull that still smoldering ship into port, and they're still trying to contain the fire on board. As we told you earlier, there were some Texas people taking off that burning cruise ship in the Gulf of Alaska over the weekend, and tonight they have just arrived at Houston Intercontinental Airport, where Eyewitness News reporter Sheriff Fryer has this report.
Homecomings are always emotional, but after an ordeal of abandoning ship at sea, coming home to family safe and sound is perhaps the most moving thing at all. For Mrs. C. Hill, for Vavy Skolaski, and the James Balk Knights from Ganado, it's the end of what should have been a wonderful vacation. Mrs. Hill, how do you feel about your vacation now?
Oh, I'm ready to go again as soon as I get some sleep. But please, dear, I don't want to sleep on the floor of the wardroom on a tanker again. I found out I'm not as well padded as I thought I was when I was sleeping on some bath towels for the padding.
So that's the way it stands out of Houston Intercontinental Airport. 4 people very glad to be on their way home. I'm Sheriff Fryer, Eyewitness News.
Residents from Ganado are feeling safe and sound at home this evening after being among those rescued from that burning Dutch liner, the Prinsendam. Eyewitness News talked with the group as they returned coming through Houston last night.
It was a high-spirited, jubilant homecoming for C. Hill, Vady Skaliski, and the James Bach Knights. The 4 Ganado passengers of the Prinsendam finally made connections into Houston last night into the waiting arms of happy family members. They called themselves the Molly Browns, unsinkable, and despite their lack of wardrobe, luggage, and in the case of Dr. Bachknight, a plastic eye, the 4 could have been any group of vacationers returning from an adventurous trip.
I'm ready to go again as soon as I get some sleep. But please, dear, I don't want to sleep on the floor of the wardroom on a tanker again.
That's not to downplay their role. Surely it was the optimism and refusal to panic that made the rescue from the Prinsendam the most successful at-sea rescue ever. And there was also courage, hours adrift in lifeboats in a cold, unrelenting sea.
Well, I was just praying that our lives would be saved.
Was it very cold? What was it like for you in the lifeboat?
I was very cold and I was bare feet. Didn't get any shoes out of the room. When I come out of the room, out into the hall, it was full of smoke.
Were you always really hopeful, or were you really afraid that maybe this time you just wouldn't get out of it?
I felt like that we were going to be saved.
Rescued they were, and none the worse for it. And typically, this crew already seems to be looking ahead.
I've had my bad luck. As soon as I get some clothes, I'm going to Las Vegas, because I'm bound to have good luck out there.
Sheriff Fryer, Eyewitness News.
Thank you, Chris. Some of the passengers who were on board the luxury liner Prinsendam when it caught fire last weekend say if the ship had to be abandoned more quickly, they all would have died. The passengers say the crew was unprepared for an evacuation and some lifeboats and other emergency equipment did not work. The fire, believed to have started in the engine room of the ship, was contained for about 3 hours, and that gave the crew enough time to get everyone off the ship. Computers helped speed the rescue of the passengers on the Prinsendam from their lifeboats. Tim Malloy reports that 4 ships in the area were notified just within minutes of the distress call from the luxury liner.
When the first distress call came from the Prinsendam, the Coast Guard put its computerized AMVER communication system into motion. Within minutes, 4 ships within 500 miles of the stricken vessel were contacted. Fortunately, another ship was closer.
Fire at sea is, I think, is probably the worst situation you're ever going to run into on a ship. Pretty scary, actually.
Lieutenant Commander Michael Leva has been involved in hundreds of rescues at sea. So has Lieutenant Commander Craig Judd. Both men consider the rescue and the transfer of the passengers a job well done under the worst of circumstances.
The fire started at something about 2 o'clock in the morning, which is the worst time it could ever happen. Everybody's asleep, and the weather was bad, and they're out in the middle of the Alaskan waters, and they're with not much company and not much help.
Yet the Coast Guard was able to save all of the passengers. It amounted to a simple application of a daily training regimen, except it had to be done fast. The waters were rough and the winds were gusting to 60 knots. One by one, the passengers were lifted into the 6 Coast Guard search and rescue helicopters.
It would be relatively easy to pick them up from the liner itself, but to pick them up from a lifeboat, which is a heck of a lot smaller, is very difficult for a helicopter pilot, and the helicopter could probably not carry more than about 20 of them at a time. They saved everybody, you know. How much better can you do?
Coast Guard officials say that the ship, fortunately, was within the 250-mile range from shore where helicopters could be deployed. They say had the ship been outside that area, there would have been no telling how long a rescue would have taken or just how effective it would have been.